Our panelists will be speaking on the topic of the California business climate and its impact on the state's economy. We are joined by Lee Ohanian, professor of economics at UCLA. Lee is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Moderating is Dr. Peter Rupert. Peter is professor of economics and the executive director of the UC Santa Barbara Economic Forecast Project at UC Santa Barbara. And with that, Peter.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to have some slides. And here we go. Okay. Okay. Oops. I was going to play the Clash song, should I stay or should I go? But I'll hold off on that. We'll talk more about that later. Anyway, I'm going to briefly talk just for a few minutes about an economic update, both in the US and a little bit in Santa Barbara. Then Lee will come on and talk about what's going on in the business climate, basically, and what's going on in the state. So let me just get started. So, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent data and sort of how to interpret it, because I think there's a lot of sort of misinformation in the sense that we read the headlines and we don't really look at the fine print. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the US to begin with, and then I'm going to talk about some data in Santa Barbara. Okay, so as you may know, last week we had the payroll employment came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it was a pretty robust number. You can see it was up by 850,000, basically the highest we've seen since back a year ago, roughly last August. So this is a big number, and many economists had said, it was going to be 700 or something like that. It turned out to be 850. People were ecstatic, the market moved, blah, blah, blah. So I want to just dig a little bit deeper, just because, like Lee, we're both kind of nerds looking at data. And while there was lots of reason for optimism, let me just show you one thing that also happened. What also happened is that average weekly hours for payroll employment, it fell, you can see here, it fell from 34.8 to 34.7. Now you're going to say, hey, dude, come on, not a big deal. Well, 850,000, sure, that's a big number, no doubt about that. The movement from 34.8 to 34.7, that seems like a small number, hardly a change at all. But remember, how do we get that number? We take all of the hours worked by people and divide it by how many people are working. And in May, there were 144,900,000 people working. Well, if they were working an average of 34.8 hours, that gives us 5 billion hours worth of work in that week, okay? So that's a lot of hours, right? Now, in June, employment went up, as we saw. It went up by 850,000. The problem is that now we're at 145,759,000 workers, but they only work 34.7 hours. Meaning that hours of work only went up by 15 million. Now, fine, that's a lot of hours still. But now what we can do is we can say, okay, suppose as they did this increase in hours, they're only working 34.7 hours each. So let's divide that 15 million by 34.7. What do we get? We get that in terms of employment, the employees really, because they worked fewer hours, employment really only went up by 432,000 and some change. Meaning that if you think about the productivity of the US economy, what goes into our output, production, is those hours worth of work. And so hours didn't go up by 850,000 times 34.7, right? So the point is that, yes, it was a pretty good report by most people. I think it was a little bit of a disappointing report, to be honest. And the second thing that happened is we know that initial claims that came out this morning bumped up a little bit. So look, the economy is still fighting to get back to where it was pre-pandemic. There's no doubt about that, and we're going to have to keep monitoring that. So if we look at Santa Barbara, you can see what's happened in Santa Barbara, basically, that employment, obviously fell a lot during the pandemic, and we've started to come back, but we're still a long way from where we were pre-pandemic. We're still, only at about 185,000 workers, where we used to be over 200, close to 200,000. So we've got a lot of work to do still. And if you look at the two biggest hit sectors, leisure and hospitality, and if you look inside that at the food and drinking establishments, that's here, food and drinking, you can see again, we're way, way down from where we were pre-pandemic, and we had been rising pretty substantially. And the other part that's been really large is obviously accommodations. Now, as we start to open up a little bit more, I think people are banking on sort of a big tourist industry. I know that Southwest Airlines, has worked really hard to think about tourism. They opened up, they're starting to fly in Santa Barbara. They've started, they're flying to other tourist destinations. Basically, I think one of their bets was that they think that tourism is going to come back, whereas business conferences are going to be much, much slower. So they're kind of banking on tourism to come back. So again, we're still down. We're coming back, obviously, but as you can see, the unemployment rate is still much, much higher than it was pre-pandemic, when it was way, very low, pretty much the lowest we've ever seen. So the pandemic has changed a lot of things. So again, we're fighting to come back. We're on the upswing, which is good. Of course, things can happen, but things are looking pretty good overall in terms of growth. Now, another thing that you might have heard and maybe panicked about, and I think a lot of people did, is that we just heard recently that California had a decline in population of 182,000, which is down about 0.5% between January 2020 and January 2021. First time in history that the population has actually declined. Now, it made the news all over the place. But if you just dig a little bit deeper, so why did it decline? And I will say now it's a little bit, misleading to say that, people are just leaving like crazy, even though Lee's going to talk a little bit about businesses leaving. So why did this occur? Well, first of all, there's something called a natural increase. The natural increase is births minus deaths. So birth minus deaths has been declining. That is, the natural increase has been slowing down, not just in California, but throughout the nation. It's happened a little bit more in California. And by the way, both births have been falling and deaths have been rising. Now, deaths have been rising where the population's aging, there are fewer kids being born. So the natural increase in population has been declining. So that turned out to be about a loss of 24,000. And these were non-COVID deaths. Secondly, there was a loss in a suspension of visa, the visa program. So we lost a lot of foreign immigration. We lost about 100,000 relative to what we normally get in the state. Finally, COVID deaths. And by the way, these are called excess deaths. These are excess deaths, meaning that normally over the last 3 years, we know what that number of deaths is on average, and we had a lot more. So COVID increased that by about 20%. So that's a big number. So what does that mean? It means that, look, because of COVID, because of the visa suspension, those are things that normally don't happen. And so I think this is a one-off thing for California's population. You should know that net domestic migration has fallen. That is, more people are leaving the state. The domestic residents are leaving the state and that are coming in from domestic. By the way, that is not new. That's happened 10 straight years for California, that more people domestic residents have left the state that come in. It's happened for 5 straight years for Santa Barbara. And what Santa Barbara is, we're down even more than the state as a whole for that year. We're down about 2.1%. We lost from 450,511 down to 441,172. So this population has been changing. COVID has affected it a lot. So, you know, the point here is not really to panic just because we saw that one time. But as I said, Lee is going to talk a little bit more about some of those things that we see. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Lee Ohanian. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to have Lee. You see I'm wearing my UCSB economics shirt. Lee has been very, very well trained in economics. He got his undergraduate degree at UC Santa Barbara, of course. And it turns out that he and I went to exactly the same university to get our PhD, the University of Rochester. Lee has been with the Hoover Institution. You can see him on MSNBC. He's been there. He's been on NPR, blah, blah, blah. Lee's been all over. Anyway, Lee will, thank you very much for being here, Lee, and take it away.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to join you today. And Peter, I'll just say if I can get one of those shirts, the next time I'm on here, I'll wear that shirt with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share some slides with you. So I'm going to try to get a full screen representation here. Okay, terrific. Okay, all right. Thanks again. Thanks so much for having me. So in roughly 25 minutes, half hour, I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, roughly the last century of economic and cultural history in the state we love. And based on the title, you can see where I'm going to go with this. And in particular, what I'm going to do is compare economic and government policy outcomes between 2 periods. One's going to be the period up through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, a period of remarkably rapid economic growth, remarkably rapid population growth, and what's generally considered to be extremely good functional governance on the basis of both state government and local government. And then I'm going to compare that to a period from about the mid-1970s on in which economic growth and population growth slowed dramatically. Cost of living has spiraled. The challenges facing businesses have increased remarkably. And in my opinion, and I hope you'll see what I'm talking about by the end of today's hour, that there is a remarkable change in the quality and the functionality of governance. Again, at the state level, which I will focus on today, and then also at the local government level. And this is really going to be a story about a growing disconnect between what is expected of government in terms of accountability of government, and also a disconnect between the priorities of government and the priorities of its citizens. And an important question that, that Peter and I talk about, many other economists talk about, is why this disconnect between citizens and government is growing. And I'll give you my theory about that and what we can do about it. And in particular, when we talk about dysfunctional governance, a lack of accountability on the part of government, lack of accountability, and this really relates to inadequate incentives within state and local government, the solutions are going to be really obvious and not at all difficult from the standpoint of economics. It's just going to be the application of common sense, long-standing economic thinking, and a more limited, more focused leadership role for government. Okay, so let me spend like 30 seconds on what I call the dream that became California. Peter and I both grew up in California, and this was really the California that we grew up in. So let's take a walk back in history to 1900. California was a large, sleepy place of 2 million people. It was about an average size state at that time. To put in context, Alabama and Mississippi were larger. Ohio was nearly 4 times larger. Just the city of Chicago is nearly as large as the entire state of California. And then if we move 60 years ahead in time to 1960, California had become the place that everybody wanted to be. From 2 million to 16 million, from 2.5% of the population to 9% of the US population. To put that in perspective, if California had grown just at the national average between 1900 and 1960, its population at that time would have been about 4.5 million rather than 16 million. So you can see that just literally hordes of people came streaming into California during this period. And this really accelerated around the time of World War II and after World War II. Now, managing the state's growth, sorry, I'm just trying to remove a banner I have up here. Great. So managing the state's economic growth and its population growth was incredibly challenging because we go back to that period in time, that was the time of the baby boom generation. So, you know, I'm one of those folks. And what that meant is that in the 1960s in California, it was a young population. 50% of the state's residents were under 24 years of age, which meant relatively few taxpayers. And the per capita state budget at that time was just 1/5 of today's California state per capita budget adjusted for inflation. Okay, so whatever the government was going to try to do with their budget, they were under the gun by a factor of 5 compared to today. And there were enormous budget demands, particularly from this group of young people. You know, again, yours truly was one of them. But the state government found a way to build schools and hospitals and invest in water infrastructure, build roads and highways, utilities, state colleges. They found a way to do that despite a budget that was just 1/5 the size of today. Now, why was it so effective at that time? Well, it really is just based on what I call the principles of governance. And there too, you know, invest and use those resources efficiently. And how to do that? Well, spend based on what your citizens really desire and then do it efficiently. Okay, so from that perspective, at that time, back in the days of the 1960s, and you know, if I have any fellow old timers, I was just a little kid then, but Pat Brown was governor at that time, Democrat. Capital investment was about 25% of the state budget. That prioritization of investment for the future is how the government was able to create schools and universities, you know, major water infrastructure projects, including the California Water Project, road investments, utilities investments, hospital investments. So there is a prioritization for investment. And the way I think about it is that California was such a success at that time because government facilitated the creation of the California Dream. There was an incredibly effective public-private partnership between the government and the private sector. And what I've done here is I've lifted a few quotes from Governor Pat Brown's budget statements from the early 1960s. And of course, Pat Brown was former Governor Jerry Brown's dad. And so so you can read these along with me. You know, we must invest to accommodate our magnificent growth. Government's priority is to protect and invest. We can't abuse our taxpayers. We must use their precious tax dollars wisely. Okay, so there's really a very focused vision of limited government and public investment. Okay, so that's really the backdrop of how California became the go-to destination and why, you know, I, as a kid, growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, I and my friends, and I'm sure Peter will, may say something similar, really, we thought that everything and anything was possible if you were in California. Okay, now let's take a look at California today. As I mentioned, real per capita spending, inflation adjusted per person, is 5 times higher than today. But a lot of basic government functions are just not getting done. Investment is inadequate. It's about 4% of the budget. That doesn't even cover depreciation. And once you look at that number, it's not surprising that California's infrastructure was graded a D+ by America's Society of Civil Engineers. 1,680 dams are in risky condition, and 1 out of 18 bridges in our state is structurally deficient. So these are basic government functions. And you remember what Pat Brown said, the most important functions of government is to protect. And I agree with that entirely. And these are basic functions that just aren't getting done. And these numbers are alarming, okay? 5–6% of our bridges are structurally deficient. As an example, let me point to the Oroville Dam up in Northern California. And the dam's breachway failed in 2017. Maybe not all that surprising. That dam was built in 1968. And this could have been a remarkable disaster. 188,000 people had to be evacuated in 2017 when the breachway failed. And when we think about accountability and government priorities, there were recommendations to retrofit the Oroville Dam in the year 2005. Those recommendations weren't heeded. Cracks appeared in the years 2013, 2014, 2015. No repairs were done. So again, we talk about, where's the accountability? This is obviously a public policy failure. It took $1.1 billion to fix the Oroville Dam, compared to an estimated $40 million retrofit. Let me go back to accountability. Where's the accountability? This simply shouldn't have happened. This is costing taxpayers, including somewhat of a subsidy from the rest of the country, because the federal government paid for part of that. This simply shouldn't have happened. This wouldn't happen in a functional, efficient government. Now, speaking about water, we haven't made major water investments in decades. Many of our major water pipes are cast iron. They're 60 years old or more. The lifespan for a cast iron water pipe is 55 years. So when you're driving, wherever you're joining us from, when you're driving, you see a gusher on the road and there's a detour, it's not surprising that pipe has failed. We haven't had a new major water investment since the California Water Project that was begun in 1960. And interestingly, was never completed from the standpoint of its original designers who created that project back in the late 1950s. Most of the California Water Project, ended up in about the early to mid 1970s. The state's added 12 million people since the 1980s, but our water capacity is roughly unchanged. And we have drought on average in California. I'll call that semi-regular. About 1 every 3 years is a drought year in California. And what happens is water rationing, which damages state agriculture. It creates lots of challenges and difficulties for non-agricultural businesses and also households. And again, when this is a basic function of government, why haven't we made those investments? Why isn't there accountability for this failure? Now, the flip side of water is really, all of you are aware of the kinds of wildfires we've had in California in recent years. 9 of the 10 biggest California fires measured as acreage have occurred in just the last 10 years. And there's a generally accepted recognition that our failure to thin forests, create new fire breaks, conduct prescribed burns have all been a contributing factor to this. And we also have some blame to put on public utilities, in which state regulators did not provide adequate oversight of those public utilities, including making sure that generation stations were far from potential fuel sources. And as a Californian, my perspective is chronic drought and wildfires have just become a way of life. And ironically, in the most technologically advanced state, in the most technologically advanced country in the world. Again, where's the accountability? Let me spend a moment talking about roads. Our overall infrastructure was given a grade of D+ by the civil engineers. They were a little bit rougher on our roads, a grade of D. The Society of Automobile Insurance, which is a industry trade association, has estimated that deficient roads in California cost California drivers $27 billion annually in repairs and insurance premiums. To put that in perspective, that is about 14% of last year's complete state government budget. Not just the roads we drive on, 4,600 miles of LA sidewalks, nearly half of LA sidewalks are broken, and I don't mean hairline cracks, I mean broken. There's an inadequate repair budget within Los Angeles. LA faces 400 personal injury litigations annually just from fall injuries that occur on city sidewalks. And let me juxtapose this with Pat Brown's 1961 budget statement. Government's priority is to protect and invest. So obviously government priorities have changed. More broadly, it's not just our dams and our roads and our sidewalks, but let's look at infrastructure within government organizations. So you probably read or seen somewhere in the media about the employment department's dramatic crash, in which its 40-year-old IT system didn't have the capacity to handle all the unemployment claims that occurred during COVID. And it was actually much worse than that. It approved lots of fraudulent unemployment claims. Unemployment claims that came from someone masquerading as Senator Dianne Feinstein, unemployment claims that were paid to convicted felons in our prison system, including convicted murderers. And it says $400 million in fraudulent claims paid. Actually, that's been recently updated. The state now acknowledges 32 billion in fraudulent claims paid. Now, to put that in perspective, in the private sector, an IT system that has 40-year-old hardware and that's running, for folks who know computer systems, that's running a software app called COBOL, which is an acronym for Common Oriented Business Language. That's a software that was developed in the 1950s. So 40-year-old hardware, 60 to 70-year-old software. I would love to hear from anyone who tells me, yeah, our computer system's 40 years old and we use COBOL, yeah, in a competitive industry, because you just couldn't survive. Competition incentivizes efficiency. This is a failure on the part of government's most important job, to protect people. And by the way, all those, those people who are filing unemployment claims during COVID, ironically, those who filed legitimate unemployment claims and that were backlogged for months, that's a huge failure. That's a failure to protect. Again, I come back to the issue of incentives and accountability. Housing. California is 49th in construction and affordability. Hawaii is the worst in affordability, but that's obviously just kind of a one-off because of what Hawaii is. To give you an idea of just how bad affordability is, San Francisco, Bay Area, and Silicon Valley have the highest median household income, but only 18% of San Francisco households and Silicon Valley households can afford the median priced home in those locations. In the rest of the country, 2/3 of households can afford the median priced home. Why aren't we building enough? State and local government policies. Again, this goes back to governance. Our living costs are 50% higher than the national average. We have the 7th highest electricity costs, 7th highest gasoline prices. And when you look at those numbers, it's perhaps not surprising that 38% of Californians live in poverty as defined by the Bureau of the Census or near poverty. At least 25% of the country's homeless are in California. 14 million Californians are on Medicaid, which is the government provided and subsidized healthcare plan for extremely low income individuals and families. If we just called those 14 million Californians on Medicaid, very low income people, their own state, they would be the 5th largest state in the United States. Today, the California dream, the one that I grew up with, the one that Peter grew up with, many of you may have grown up with, that really doesn't really exist anymore, at least for most of the people in the state. Okay, so here's my idea about how do we lose our way? Well, the shared principles of governance, this highly functional partnership between government and the private sector, the idea that government should have a limited focus and should use tax dollars wisely and efficiently and should be really focused on investment, that all changed. That all changed right around 1970. And around that time, environmental damage became increasingly important and increasingly recognized in the country. And that gave birth to what would be called the environmental movement. And that environmental movement became highly politicized. And from my standpoint, that remarkable politicization of the environmental movement eschewed the standard application of common sense economic thinking, which economists call cost-benefit analysis, which Pat Brown would call spend wisely. And this abandonment of common sense economic analysis spread to other areas of policymaking. And over the last 45 years or so, the state has lost efficiency, accountability, and what I would say reasonable limits on government. Okay, I'm going to go through the next couple of slides really quickly, make sure we have time for questions at the end. I view the tipping point as the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. It received remarkable coverage throughout the media. It really shone the spotlight on the environmental consequences of economic growth. If we step back for a moment and say, okay, what happens when there are negative consequences from growth? Well, there's a very standard way to think about this from the standpoint of economics. It's what economists call an externality, a cost imposed on others from one party. The standard solution is that we force the one party to internalize those effects that they pay and that they're incentivized to pay. And in that process, they become more careful. They take on some additional costs in how they produce. And as a result, fewer Santa Barbara oil spills happen. The guiding principle of this is what we would call benefit cost analysis. What Jerry Brown would call spending your dollars wisely. We could have protected the environment and maintained our previous focus model of governance. And from my standpoint, we probably should have done, we should have paid more attention to this earlier. And I learned a lot about environmental economics from two emeritus UCSB economics professors, really both of whom are remarkable economists, Bob Deacon and John Sossley, both of whom I took classes from when I was a student at UCSB. Now, we waited, again, I think a little bit too long, and the Santa Barbara oil spill was so dramatic that a different approach was taken. It was what I would say a political approach, do whatever it takes. Now, the environmental protection movement became a much broader political movement. And the foundation of that movement was, well, growth and corporate greed are the problem. And suddenly government was incentivized by the environmental movement to take on a much larger vision of what they should be doing. And what we saw really very quickly after that, more business regulations, more labor regulations, much more government spending as the numbers we looked at before. And if government spending more, then taxes are higher. To accelerate these challenges, California essentially became a one-party state after Proposition 187, which was related to immigration. Before Proposition 187, there was a 40% Republican voter share. Today, it's about 24%. And this is not, I don't say this in a partisan vision. I'm a political independent, but without competition, without political competition, and in my view, no matter who is the one party, without political competition, this new vision of government grew unchecked. Okay. Now, oftentimes people ask me, Lee, if you could change one policy in California, what would you change? And I would say we should modify the California Environmental Quality Act. It was signed into law by Ronald Reagan in 1970 when he was governor. And the law reads, adopt all feasible measures to mitigate environmental impacts of development. Well, development is naturally going to have environmental impacts. So any development is going to have environmental consequences. And feasible doesn't mean practical. It doesn't mean tax dollars are being spent wisely. And this really paved the way to begin abandoning fiscal discipline and efficiency of government. California Environmental Quality Act is called CEQA within housing circles. As one land use attorney remarked to me, it's been weaponized to fight development. So when you ask, why is it that California is 49th in the country in terms of building making residential investments, CEQA is a big part of that. It's not the whole thing, but it's a big part of that. And to give you an idea of this, I collected some data from the US Census on California housing costs. And between 1940 and 1970, which was really the heyday of all those people moving into the state of California, California housing on average costs about 35% more than the rest of the country. But there was no rising trend. It was about 35% in 1940, it was about 35% in 1970. Supply grew with demand. But after 1970, construction dropped enormously, and that house price premium rose to 80%, from 35% to 80% by 1980. Today, California is home to 10 of the 11 most expensive housing metro areas in the country and 10 of 12 most expensive rental markets in the country. And there's wide agreement that CEQA and then restrictive zoning, I'm not going to have time to talk about that today, are viewed as reducing supply sharply and increasing construction costs. The median California single-family home, I just saw some new numbers on this. It's up to $800,000 for a single-family home and $550,000 for a condo. Rest of the country's single-family home median price about $300,000, and that California housing price premium that was 35% back in the day, back when I was a little kid, it's now 137% today. To put that perspective, if the housing price premium remained 35% it was in 1970, the median California home price would be $400,000 today. And we wouldn't be having all of these stories about skyrocketing and incredibly high California housing costs. And rents and prices go hand in hand. So what costs $1,400 in rent for the rest of the country is about $2,800 for California. I'll give you, this is my favorite example of how CEQA creates just enormous inefficiencies and raises costs. In 1994, Newhall Ranch, which was a planned community, it would have been a bedroom community of Los Angeles. It's about 33 miles outside of Los Angeles. It was going to be a 60,000 person planned community. Plans were submitted in 1994. It took 25 years to resolve all CEQA related lawsuits. And how did the developer get the litigant to drop the last lawsuit? Well, that litigant was an environmental activist group out of Phoenix, not from California. They're headquartered out of Phoenix. And they got that litigant to drop the lawsuit by agreeing to build 20,000 electric vehicle charging ports. 20,000 charging ports in a city of 60,000. How many electric vehicles do we have in the state? About 1% of cars are electric vehicles in California. 25 years to resolve lawsuits, and the final agreement is one in which 80% of these electric car charging ports are just going to sit there and depreciate. Model homes, yeah, might be available later this year. But it didn't have to be this way. It makes no sense whatsoever to take 25 years to resolve a 60,000 person planned community. Again, where is the accountability? And it's not just CEQA and zoning. There's also remarkable efficiency losses within state government. So we always hear about things like affordable housing. Now, on this slide, I put affordable housing in quote marks because it's anything but affordable. It costs a minimum of $700 per square foot to build what's called affordable housing in California. And I'm sure we have some real estate people in the audience and construction people in the audience. Anywhere from $700 to $1,000 per square foot. I'll go out on a limb and just say that's pretty close to Ritz-Carlton, Ty Warner building costs, enormous luxury levels. It shouldn't be nearly that costly to build housing. I'll give you one example. Santa Clara County up in Silicon Valley bought an extended stay motel. Okay, so you may have stayed in one of those. They're 300 square feet. They have a kitchenette, they have a bedroom, they have a very small seating area, living room area. They bought that hotel, which was considered to be in very good condition, for $14 million. And they're turning those into apartments. So in real estate circles, this would be called a property flip. All the county is doing is adding a communal kitchen, laundry facilities, and outdoor recreation. Well, adding a communal kitchen, a laundry room, and a basketball court and a couple of tennis courts and some croquet, that costs $15 million. Okay, I called a friend of mine who lives on the East Coast, who's commercial developer, specializes in apartments. And I said, I don't know how big this communal kitchen is going to be, but just kind of off the top of your head, how much would it cost you to put in these facilities? And he said, yeah, I don't know. He said, I think I could do it. I think I could make a nice profit and do a really nice job. Probably around $300,000. I think probably less than that. Okay, so $15 million to build a kitchen. So for those of you thinking about remodeling, I wouldn't call up the state to help you out with this. 15 million, and nowhere along the way did someone ask, hey, something's wrong with this. This just doesn't smell right. No one's questioning this. And we go back to accountability and incentives. I'm just going to say maybe one or two more slides, and then we'll get to questions. And this last slide I'm going to talk about is state budget skyrockets. It rose 142% between 1970 and 1978. And that skyrocketing budget is the reason why Jarvis and Gann were able to get Proposition 13 passed to slow property tax increases. Well, you often hear the point that California is in dire fiscal shape because of this 40-year-old Proposition 13. Well, that's not entirely true, because the legislature responded by raising income taxes, corporate taxes, and sales taxes. California is second to only New York in government spending per person. We have the 5th highest personal tax burden, the 3rd highest business tax burden. We all have read about the businesses that have left California. Bank of America many years ago. In December, Hewlett-Packard, Tesla, and Occidental Petroleum all announced within the same week they were leaving California, moving to Texas. Charles Schwab is leaving for Texas. Toyota left, Nissan, Nestle's. They've all relocated to low-cost states. Texas is the major relocation destination. Texas has no personal income tax. My oldest son just got married, and he and his wife bought a 4,000 square foot 5-bedroom home in North Dallas for $370,000. And this trend is going to continue, is what I suspect, as the pandemic has shown how work has become more fluid and more can be done remotely. California is ranked 49th in business-friendly policies, 48th in economic freedom. Are politicians listening? Where is the accountability? And so, you know what, I have some more slides, but let me just stop right there and just jump to the conclusion, which is all we need to do is go back to the governing principles of limited, focused government that uses tax dollars wisely, that applies, even just informally, cost-benefit analysis, that invests and that puts the interests of a broad group of people ahead of smaller, politically favored constituents. There's a blueprint for what to do. And I recently did a webinar with Eleni Kounalakis, who's the state's lieutenant governor. And she, not surprisingly, was pushing back on a lot of this. And my closing remark was, accountability and incentives never go out of style. These are fundamental for any well-functioning organization. And it's there for our taking. The question just becomes, how do we do that? So anyway, let me stop here, and I'm happy to share ideas and take questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Lee. So you got to Prop 13. A couple people mentioned, can you talk a little bit about the effects of Prop 13? And you did mention that, sure, they slowed the growth in property taxes, but they raised other taxes at the same time. So on net, what do you think?
Yeah. So in 2020, there was a ballot initiative to do what's called a split roll tax system, which would have maintained Prop 13 at the residential level, but would have removed Prop 13 production at the business level. Interestingly, didn't pass. And what keeps me optimistic about California is that many, what you might call progressive political bills, did not pass in the 20 election. There is new rent control regulations that did not pass, along with the fact that voters declined on the split roll. Uber and Lyft were able to get exemptions from a bill called AB 5, which I think is one of the worst bills passed in the history of California. AB 5 is a bill that makes it illegal for most independent contractors to continue to work as an independent contractor. If they want to work, they have to be hired as a formal employee. So we might be seeing the turning of the tide. Government responded by raising income taxes substantially, sales taxes substantially. We now have the highest, at the very top, the highest tax rate among all states at 13.3%. There are there's a possibility that the legislature will try to push that at 16.6%. A fellow named Josh Rao, who's a business professor a finance professor at the Stanford Business School, has estimated that there's been so many high income people leaving California that when the 13.3% surtax that was put in around 2011, 2012, and of course that, not surprising, that temporary surtax became permanent a few years later. The California's Legislative Analyst's Office had estimated that their estimate of how much additional tax revenue would come in, they were off by 60%. And Professor Rao chalks that up to the fact that people change their primary residence out of California to another state. So I don't think Prop 13 is really the big problem for us. We could manage Prop 13, in my opinion, very, very well if we simply stopped wasting money and we put accountability and incentives back within state and local government.
Got it. So, I mean, you've spoken very generally, and you've talked about a bunch of issues. So, someone asked, so what can we do locally? What can we possibly do locally? Can we take on CEQA, in Santa Barbara? Can we, what is it we can do in Santa Barbara? What kinds of things do you see that can be done locally?
Yeah, so Santa Barbara is a really interesting case. There's because obviously the state stuff, there's nothing that can be done about that. From the standpoint of housing, Santa Barbara can make it easier and less costly to build housing. When I think about Santa Barbara, I almost think that the genie might already be out of the bottle from the following standpoint. And I think this might be true of a lot of coastal California cities. You've got people who have invested their life savings into their house. So we know, if you're living in Santa Barbara, you know that $1.5 million or $2 million, it's not buying you a mansion here, far from it. So you have people who've saved up year after year who have put down $500,000 on a house, and they don't really have a whole lot of other assets. Now, you can ask Peter, is that a sensible portfolio of assets from the standpoint of everything we know about financial theory? And no, it's not. No, it's not. Housing was never meant to be an investment, but it's become that. So now we have people, and I understand this, people trying to protect their investments by saying, you know what, I don't want that high rise. I don't want a high rise apartment 3 blocks down the street from me because it's going to damage my property values. And so this is now the headwind that California has to push up against. So my perspective is, I think we probably should do a lot more in Central California. Unfortunately, we're investing a lot of money being invested in Central California, or what I would call Inland California, the San Joaquin Valley, is going to things like the bullet train, which has been just, it's just been a fiasco. But I think that is probably more of a solution than policymakers now are realizing, to incentivize economic development in that area. Santa Barbara is going to continue to be a tourist-centric location with some highly skilled professionals, medical professionals, legal professionals, financial professionals, very high-skilled, high-tech manufacturing. It's probably not going to get a lot bigger. And so I think Santa Barbara will almost certainly remain, extremely unaffordable for young people and for people with low incomes.
Yeah. So going more broadly now, President Biden has, initiated a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, and you talked a lot about infrastructure. There's a bunch of infrastructure we need here too. Is that a good plan? Is that something you would recommend?
We've both in California and the state more broadly, it's not as if we're the only state with failing bridges. If I encourage people to download the American Society of Civil Engineers reports. You can get it right off the internet. And, there are a lot of states with C's on there. I don't think there's any A states. So it's not like we've been the only ones that have been remiss. But, that's what government's for. That we should have been making these investments for years. And again, we're spending so much more inflation adjusted per person. Where is it going? About 2/3 of the state budget goes to about 3 areas, just 3 areas: K through 12 education, the prison system, and health and human services, including those 14 million Medicaid folks. That's 2/3 of the budget. So when you lop off 2/3 of the pie, you think about, hey, how do we run the state's court system? And how do we fix potholes? How do we do this and this and this and this? There's not too much left over for that. So those 3 areas, I think, K through 12 education, the prison system, and health and human services, they are rife with inefficiencies. Our state prison system per inmate costs about $90,000 per year, about twice as high as the national average. And those are areas that are just ripe for reform. I don't see how we get from here to having a functional California in 10 or 15 years without making reforms in those 3 areas.
Got it. Okay, so I think we're almost out of time.
Can I just say one more thing about, I got a little carried away. I forgot to get back to your specific focus on the Biden infrastructure bill. It's called the infrastructure bill. A remarkably small share of that is going to go literally for what we would call bridges and roads and electrical utilities. My main point is that this should have been taken care of with tax dollars, for the last few decades. It's not as if we have to say, hey, we need more money for infrastructure. My whole, the whole point of today's presentation was that we've lost sight of what the true priorities of good government are, which is protecting us. That's way, way far down on the priorities list. If it hadn't been, we wouldn't be looking at these D+ and D roads and bridges today. So let me stop there. Thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to share these ideas with you.
Great, thanks so much, Lee. Some of you we couldn't get to all the questions. I apologize. You can feel free to email me at peter.rupert@ucsb.edu if any of you want to continue the conversation. And Lee has also said he's willing to to chat to people if they feel that there's interest there. So you can reach out to me and I can put you in touch with Lee. Anyway, thanks again, Lee, and I want to thank all the attendees for being here and asking questions. And we'll be talking more issues coming up over the next few months. We will talk about water. We're going to talk about hopefully cannabis and wine and agriculture. Housing, of course, is a big one. So we're going to get to all those over the next few months. Anyway, stay tuned. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Oh, the PowerPoint slides, Lee's slides will be available. My slides will be available. And we also have the recording that's available as well. So we'll put all those up on the Economic Forecast Project website.